Next time you're on a flight, pull up the map on the screen in front of you, find the altitude reading. It'll probably say somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 feet. And at some point, if you're the kind of person who asks questions, you might wonder, why that number? Why not 50,000? Why not 60,000? Let's start with where you actually are when you're on a commercial flight, because most people have no real sense of it. At 40,000 feet, the outside air temperature is around minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. That's colder than anywhere on the surface of Earth. Antarctica in winter doesn't get that cold. The air pressure outside your window is less than a quarter of what it is at sea level. If a hole appeared in the fuselage the size of a grapefruit, the cabin would depressurize in seconds. And without the pressurized, temperature-controlled environment of that cabin, a human being at 40,000 feet would lose useful consciousness in roughly 15 to 20 seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The air is simply too thin to deliver enough oxygen to your brain to keep you functional. You are, in the most literal sense, in an environment that is completely hostile to human life. The only thing standing between you and that environment is a few inches of engineered aluminum and a pressurization system running continuously for the entire flight. Now here's where it gets interesting. You might assume that if 40,000 feet is already this extreme, going higher would just be more of the same. More cold, more thin air, more pressure difference. But that's not quite right, because above 40,000 feet, something changes. Something that doesn't just affect the passengers, it affects the aircraft itself. The air becomes so thin that jet engines start to struggle. Not gradually, significantly. A jet engine works by pulling in air, compressing it, mixing it with fuel, and igniting it. That combustion drives the turbines that generate thrust. The entire system depends on a sufficient quantity of air entering the engine. Above 40,000 feet, the air density drops to a point where the engines can't pull in enough of it to maintain efficient combustion. Thrust drops, fuel efficiency collapses. The aircraft starts to lose the ability to maintain speed and altitude simultaneously. And then there's something called coffin corner, one of the most unsettling concepts in aviation. At extreme altitudes, a plane faces two simultaneous threats from opposite directions. If it flies too slowly, the wings can't generate enough lift and the plane stalls. It essentially stops flying and begins to fall. If it flies too fast, the airflow over the wings becomes supersonic in places, creating shock waves that can cause the aircraft to lose control. At low altitudes, there's a comfortable margin between those two speeds. But as altitude increases, those two danger zones creep closer and closer together. At around 45,000 to 50,000 feet in a typical commercial aircraft, they meet. The safe flying speed range narrows to almost nothing. A margin of just a few knots separates controlled flight from catastrophe. That's coffin corner, and it's one of the primary reasons commercial aviation stays well below it. The Concorde, the legendary supersonic passenger jet that flew from the 1970s to 2003, actually cruised at around 60,000 feet, higher than any commercial aircraft before or since. And to do that, it required an entirely different airframe, entirely different engines, and an entirely different pressurization system. It was an extraordinary engineering achievement. It was also extraordinarily expensive to operate, which is ultimately why it was retired. The message is clear. Going higher is possible, but the cost and engineering complexity, fuel consumption, and operational risk rises exponentially with every additional 1,000 feet. So let's get precise about what's actually happening at cruise altitude, because the physics here are genuinely fascinating. At 38,000 feet, air density is roughly 25% of what it is at sea level. That means for every cubic meter of space, there is only 1/4 of the air molecules you'd find at ground level. For a jet engine that needs to process enormous volumes of air every second, this matters enormously. Modern high-bypass turbofan engines, the kind on virtually every commercial aircraft today, are specifically designed to operate efficiently in this thin air environment. They work by pulling in large volumes of air through a massive front fan. Most of that air bypasses the core combustion chamber entirely, providing thrust directly. A smaller portion enters the core, gets compressed by multiple stages of rotating blades, mixes with jet fuel, and ignites. The compression stage is critical. The engine essentially has to artificially recreate a denser air environment inside itself to make combustion work at altitude. At 38,000 feet, the compressor stages are working at their designed optimal range, squeezing thin air into the concentration needed for efficient combustion. Go much higher, and the compressors can't keep up. The air entering the engine is simply too sparse to compress into a usable concentration. Thrust drops. Specific fuel consumption rises sharply. The aircraft becomes progressively less capable of maintaining speed. Meanwhile, the airframe itself is under constant stress from pressurization. Inside the cabin, air pressure is maintained at the equivalent of roughly 6,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level, comfortable enough for passengers to breathe without supplemental oxygen. Outside, the pressure is the equivalent of 40,000 feet. Every surface of the fuselage is constantly managing that pressure differential, the inside pushing outward, the outside pushing inward. Aircraft fuselages are specifically engineered to handle this stress repeatedly over thousands of flight cycles. But it is stress, real, measurable, cumulative stress on the metal and composite materials of the airframe. This is why aircraft have defined service life limits, why a fuselage that has completed a certain number of pressurization cycles is retired or extensively rebuilt, regardless of its apparent condition. And then there's the aerodynamics. At 38,000 feet, a commercial aircraft is flying at around 85% of the speed of sound. The wings are carefully shaped to manage airflow at exactly this combination of speed and air density. The angle at which air meets the wing, the angle of attack, is precisely calibrated for this environment. This is why altitude, speed, and aircraft design are inseparable. A plane optimized for 38,000 feet at Mach 0.85 cannot simply be flown at 50,000 feet. Every variable changes. The wings that generate efficient lift at one altitude and speed become inefficient or dangerous at another. The 35,000 to 40,000 foot cruising band isn't arbitrary. It's the zone where all of these competing factors, engine efficiency, aerodynamic performance, pressurization stress, and weather avoidance, reach their optimal balance simultaneously. Below it, drag costs too much. Above it, the engineering challenges become prohibitive. It's a narrow window, and we've been flying in it for 70 years. So here's the question for the comments. If hypersonic passenger flights became available tomorrow, at maybe 5 times the price of a regular ticket, would you buy one? And what route would you take? Drop your answer below, because this is one of those questions where the answers say a lot about how differently people think about time, money, and the experience of travel. If this video gave you something to think about next time you're at 38,000 feet, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.